Okay, good morning, everyone. Today we are going to talk about vaccine hesitate in Germany. Germany is ranked as number 8 out of 195 by Global Health Index security for COVID-19 preparedness, but is still having some challenge in vaccine hesitate. Despite the fact being the home of vaccine and being the home of biotechnology vaccine, is still having a challenge on COVID-19's hesitant peoples. So in that regard, we are going to talk about it right now.
So what has been the story surrounding vaccination in Germany? Narratives such as stay home and stay safe have been very familiar to us from the first wave of COVID-19. But when vaccinations began rolling out, the narrative changed. The headlines can be seen on the screen, but the main message that the German public was being exposed to was that they were being urged to get vaccinated and it was being called their duty. But this is what the public was, or the public narrative was. But what was the narrative in government? The government's plan for vaccination can be seen in their national vaccination strategy, and that is the focus of our analysis.
So why this strategy? We searched on the German Health Ministry website and found this strategy. This strategy actually, as a national guidance, can affect every sub-level, operates at a macro level. And the governmental officials will keep the idea of this strategy in mind when planning and implementing the real vaccination action to the public. So we carefully read this whole strategy and consulted with the expert, Professor Adam in the global health area, and also we reached Gaia for some policy suggestions. We turned to the narrative policy framework. So the narrative policy framework is a theory of the policy process whose central question turns to the power of narrative. We believe the narrative of this strategy can affect every sub-level, and that affected the implementation of this strategy. By analyzing and modifying this strategy, it can give a different feeling to the task receivers and then change the implementation of this strategy. We imitated the table of our third policy lab exercise and to deeply analyze this strategy. Now let's get into more in details.
So let's start with setting and time. The whole strategy focuses on the present and the future in terms of time, and for the setting, as you see in these are excerpts and also screenshots from the strategy. And for the setting, it occurs the whole territory of Germany. For objective and identity, the mega objective is a threefold. First is to counter the spread of the virus. The second objective is to reduce the potential health-related consequences of infection. And last but not least is preventing the health system from being overrun. And for the identity, although it exists in the text, it is not very strong. We just find one identity. This is the mantra or the name of the campaign, Together Against Corona. So this is the only identity that we find out, and we assume that it could be weak in this strategy. And for types of evidence, as you see in the screen, there are several pieces of evidence. For example, on page 6, the vaccine candidate is capable of producing the protective effect. So these are several evidences that we found across the strategy.
Well, we identified 3 categories of characters: villain, victims, and heroes. The strategy is clear on its villain, the COVID-19 virus, but it also mentions misinformation as one of the reasons why the strategy will not work. On the victims, the strategy is not clear. It only implies that the German population is the victim, but it does not clearly state this. You have to read really deep to get that. The hero in this strategy is the narrator, the government of Germany, and the second order hero are the stakeholder that helps the government of Germany to implement this strategy.
Another component under the narrative policy framework refers to moral or call for the action. Again, similar to some previous sections, there is some evidence or examples, but not strong or vivid. For example, we have on page 11, special requirements for transfer and storage condition must be taken into account, but we infer that it is not as strong as it should be. So these are a list of some morals across the strategy.
In the values that we were able to see in the strategy, we also noticed that the values face the same problem as the models. It's only implied, it's not clearly stated that this is what the German government wants. The doomsday is interesting because the strategy does not clearly state the doomsday. Instead, it says what will happen if vaccination happens. It does not state what will happen to the public if vaccination does not happen. We thought the doomsday is so weak. The same applies to drama. The only text that we find in the strategy that could be related to drama was this, which once again, it's so weak.
So what was evident from this analysis is that at least 3 crucial elements of the COVID emergency and the vaccination campaign are only marginal. Whether it is about victims, doomsday scenarios, or public responsibility, these elements are only whispered in the strategy but not stated clearly. And these are elements that cannot miss from such a strategy. In fact, if we look at the last Eurobarometer, we can see that the reason why some Germans did not get vaccinated is that because they are worried about side effects, or they are concerned about the risks. So fear and risk concern the emotional sphere. And if we look at the cloud that we sent around to our peers, we see that getting vaccinated is related to some sort of community feeling. And there are studies that actually prove that the community feelings and emotional elements in general affect the willingness to get vaccinated. So it is a matter of fact that these emotional elements are inherent to the very essence of what the vaccination campaigns are. They are just the other side of the coin. And here I would like to specify, because now you might think, okay, but this strategy doesn't aim to actually convince every German to get vaccinated. It's just a technical guideline. And we are well aware of that. But the point is that in the same way that it doesn't make sense to write a strategy without speaking about vaccines, it is not possible to write such strategies without mentioning victims, doomsday scenarios, public responsibilities. And so these two aspects are the same, the two sides of the very same coin.
So, what to do and where to go? Well, we're arguing that the German strategy, and more specifically its narrative, has to shift. It has to shift because something is missing. Some things that can be missing within academical papers, but not within people's decision-making, emotions. While the paper makes a really strong empirical evidence about the necessity of the vaccine, it doesn't ask a simple question: why? Why is it important to get vaccinated? What are all those risk-benefit ratios and negative effects all those? It's about people dying because health systems are being overrun. That's what's at stake. With the COVID-19, sadly, the German government doesn't lack neither doomsday scenario nor victims. But the fact to evacuate both components from the strategy, from its narrative, is a mistake. Rather, it should involve the German citizens politically, as citizens. Because as we see during the presentation, to direct the action of getting vaccinated toward the community, toward civic responsibility, is a really powerful way to engage people in the police. So now we could have elaborated a really specific narrative of how to do it. We thought about maybe engaging former anti-vaxxers, or maybe that the hero could be not the federal government, but the people actually getting the vaccine. Or we could have involved as well people that have relatives that actually passed away to COVID-19. But it would have been somehow paradoxical to argue for the reconnection of the authentic political ties between the government and the citizens, and to in turn propose ourselves a solution, telling them how to do it. us that barely experienced a few Holocaust and that can only look at the German citizenship from a foreign and external point of view. No, we're convinced that it is the German government's role to involve its civil servants as to how political vaccination is, not for the individual, but for the collectivity. Hence, we are arguing that by engaging with those emotional narratives during the vaccination, using doomsday scenarios, using victims, the German government will successfully engage people as citizens, increasing the rate of vaccination. And that, as well, it would mean very few extra costs, both in terms of money and in terms of time, for that anyway, the publication of new strategies was a fixed cost from the beginning for the government. Change of narrative or not change of narrative. But even if, and this is a big if, not one single person gets vaccinated due to a policy, we're still arguing that our policy solution remains extremely relevant. Finance, climate, health, the politicization has been in every corner lately. However, we're convinced that in times of crisis, more than ever, it is of the utmost necessity to put the symbolic ties between governments and citizens at the center of public debate. They have to remain in the subconscious of policymakers at every stage of the policy solutions. Thanks for listening.
Very good. I would like to ask you, what are the reasons, how do you explain that German government did not opt for the solution, for the strategy you were advocating for? What are the reasons?
We thought that because we also had some difficulties in understanding how this was possible. And the thing is that the nature of this document is very technical. It's not how to convince the people to get vaccinated. And so we believe that the reason why they should have put this narrative is more that it is a matter of fact. It's an element of the vaccination campaign. So what we thought is that maybe they did not put it because they looked only at the technical side, and they thought that the emotions are not part of this technical side. But actually, we think that they are part because it's a simple element. Like when we talk vaccines, doctors, and emotions, we believe it's just one in the chain. But maybe this view was not in their mind.
Exactly. The more an issue is scientific, the more you think it's about knowledge and knowledge only. But as we said during the presentation, evidence does not speak for itself. And it needs to be incarnated in some kind of ways.
To what the group said, in one of our class reading, one of the major policy implementation pitfalls was knowledge fallacy. In this case, the government thinks that all the people will buy into this strategy because it's full of evidence. But I feel like they got into that pitfall of just pumping more evidence to people, but not really considering the narrative, which is again logical, considering that it's vaccine. So many people are concerned about the evidence, but they're not only concerned about the evidence. There are many other things that play in people's mind before they make decisions.
Yes, that's it.
But I think here you don't have the risk to corroborate this information on the vaccination campaign, because all the fake news about vaccination mainly points on fears. And then if you already have a population that is scared, probably they will be more tempted to file kind of.
So I think it's exactly because some people are not investing the field of affect, then the field of affect is dominated by people that uses affect for misinformation. Because vaccination is also an emotional reality and not only about knowledge. I think if governments would engage with affects, but it would go against those misinformation, because now we just have people that are scared about the vaccine, but the only way those emotions are being addressed is by misinformation.
Yeah, and actually, there are two different things. One is scaring people, and the other is providing a real portrait of the possible doomsday scenario. Like if the government actually presents this as proof, because it's true that there are victims, it's true that there are emotions involved, doesn't necessarily mean scaring people. Because scaring people requires a next step in the intention on how to navigate or how to vehiculate these information. And so we believe they are two separate channels.
Yeah, but at the same time, like in Italy, they use this kind of narrative. You know, in journals or whatever, you always read about this stuff. But then the fake news and misinformation is based on the fact that the state is being catastrophist about the situation. They are trying to force us to actually vaccination.
I mean, that's true. It is a dynamic that can happen. But it is also true that if we look at the rate of vaccination people, so for example, also Italy or Portugal or New Zealand and Singapore, for example, we can see that in their narrative, there is something more emotional, like the New Zealand and Singapore invested really a lot in putting this emotional element in their strategy. And we can see that they have very high rates of vaccinations. So I guess then it comes to the implementation and how they play it when implementing.
This is just my point. Actually, Italy is just our evidence to prove. You see, the vaccination rate in Italy is higher than that in Germany. So we can see this kind of narrative strategy can actually affect the vaccination rate. And in other sense, because like the most misinformation will provide a very serious doomsday scenario in it. It's like, oh, the government is forcing us to get a vaccine, and it sounds like very horrible. And then people believe that. If we put this kind of narrative in our right way, maybe it can affect.
And just to be clear that this strategy doesn't get to the people. Like German people don't wake up and meet the government strategy. But what we want is that when the public civil servant gets this strategy on his desk, he do all the next step of the strategy, keeping in mind this element. Claudio, you want to say?
Yeah, connected to what Matilde was saying, I think you did a very professional, publishable analysis of the limitations of the German strategy. And then you say we react to disinformation by stressing the community spirit. So that's not fighting misinformation with misinformation, but working with emotions, which is also acceptable. We are not necessarily, and in your case, certainly not misinformation. Where I was a little bit waiting for more is, I wrote in my note, when do they show the money? I would have liked some examples, so like 6 memorable tweets, or because this would be the final point of your exercise, to provide some examples and avoid misunderstandings that people like Matilde and I may have thought, oh, maybe they want to misinform. Did you go in that direction?
We thought of 3 particularly because it's also about stakeholders that we involve, because some stakeholders are actually capable to mobilize emotions more than others. So according to like some research, there are like family doctors. But then there is also a narrative that is really also is the former anti-vaxxers that had one of his relatives that died from COVID-19, and then he totally shifts. And then he engages himself to voice the importance of the vaccine. And those people are then being contacted by governments to voice publicly the importance of vaccine. And this has a portion.
And also we get into how we might possibly change this strategy. So I don't know if Tutti can go back to the objective slide. Yeah. Yes.
Wait, which one?
The analysis, the one of mood.
Yep.
Yes. And so, for example, we have a sentence and the objective. Yeah. So when we say the aim is to counter the spread of the virus, the change we mean is that, for example, they only say spread of the virus, potential health-related consequence, and health system being overrun. But potential health-related consequences, it might be death, it might be losing your relatives, and the health system from being overrun is not that, you know, it's a computer system. It's health system, there are people dying and people that cannot get into this health system. So, for example, taking this sentence and just mentioning the victims and the community here, because health system is owned by community, could have an example, could be an example of what we have in mind.
Okay, we have time for another question if you want to.
Well, then I would just praise you for the extension, the penultimate slide. I say, when you said even if this doesn't work here, there is potential for depoliticization. So you thought about scaling up your strategy to other policies. It's not the question. Thank you for thinking about that part too.
Thank you very much for your work.
Thanks a lot.